Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of MedTech Frontiers. I'm Mike Heil, and I'm joined by my partner, Jody Scott. We're both partners at the law firm of Hogan Lovells in the medical device and technology practice.
This series spotlights the pivotal forces shaping the medical device industry in 2025. Regulatory shifts, political developments, strategic trends are all converging in ways that will impact the industry. And today's episode dives right in. The shape and focus of FDA and the medtech industry under the Trump administration is in a state of change. From executive orders to tariffs, new leaderships and reductions in force, how product submissions are reviewed to how and where the regulations will be enforced is undergoing reshaping and reform. Today, we will discuss some of the key initiatives and their impacts on the medical device industry. We'll also discuss how these initiatives are impacting the medtech industry, and we'll brush off our crystal ball and try to tell you where we think things are heading.
Thanks. And before we start, just want to note that our intent is to present topics as factually as we can without taking a side or a position. As with any discussion involving regulations, administrative policies, when politics are involved, there's a tendency to take a side. Our goal is to present and discuss the issues as objectively as possible. Nonetheless, to the extent that it appears that a view or a position is being taken, please note that it does not reflect the views or positions of Hogan Lovells. So with that, Jody, let's start with the changes that we've all been seeing and hearing about at the FDA and changes in personnel at CDRH. We know that the new FDA administrator is Dr. Marty Makary. And I know that you've read some of his books, and just curious, what's his background and what do you see as his priorities?
So, Dr. Makary, he's a British American surgeon and a public health researcher and an author. He's written several books. I think one of the things to think about in terms of him as the new commissioner is that he is a disruptor. I think he has challenged sort of conventional wisdom and believes heavily in science as being the basis for decision making. His medical practice is surgical oncology and gastroenterology and laparoscopic surgery. He was formerly at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and his specialty is in pancreatic cancer. So he was a practicing surgeon, but he is well known for being an advocate for patient safety, healthcare transparency, advocating for how healthcare as a whole could be delivered differently. And I think it's fair to think of him as really a disruptor and may change the way that FDA regulates. But at the end of the day, I think he is a believer in science. So, and wants the data to lead decision making. In terms of priorities, he has had opportunity since taking on the job to talk about the things that are important to him. And I'll just touch on just a couple of them. So he wants to bring consumer health technologies closer to the patients. And that means getting devices in particular into patients' hands to allow them the opportunity to take control over their own healthcare. He also is looking at strengthening his scientific review teams, making them better and stronger in doing the important work of FDA. He has also shared that he wants to promote digital health and AI integration. I think we're going to talk a little bit later about how the agency is starting to use AI in actually doing the important work that they're doing. Also, continuing on the Healthy Homes Initiative from last year, 2024, again, trying to bring medical device technology into the home so that patients can actually take care of their own health. And then really thinking about strengthening regulatory science. And so, I think there's a lot of positive things in the way that he's thinking about leading the agency. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of what we've seen with respect to other personnel within FDA. So we've seen some of the on again, off again efforts regarding sort of the numbers and personnel. What do you think about that, and what have you seen?
Yeah, it has, I think off again and on again, off again is the right way to describe it. And really it came in and started in February earlier this year. 700 probationary personnel were let go. I believe it was Valentine's Day weekend. Probationary people, folks who have been in a position or had been at the agency for 2 years or less. And it was part of a broader, DOGE initiative across the government. But what we did see at CDRH in particular was a disproportionate hit in the areas such as AI, Center of Excellence, the robotics review teams, just to name a couple. And these are the up and coming technologies. that the FDA was onboarding and having a lot of new hires because the technology is moving so rapidly. As a result of that issue, there were concerns that were raised, and a lot of them were asked to come back. Not all of them did. Then wave two was the reduction in force initiative that started in April, the very beginning of April. The overall goal was to reduce the workforce at FDA by 20%, which is about 3,500 or so people. It's noted that this is largely administrative personnel. I think that there was an effort to consolidate administrative roles and functions at the agency. But even there were people who were let go and then asked to come back. So really a lot of back and forth or stops and starts, as you noted, Jody. The other thing too is they did offer early retirement across the government, where I believe the personnel could leave and still get paid until September, October of this year. So there's been a lot of resources that have left the agency, a lot of institutional knowledge that's left. I think, overall, the primary concern was that this is going to have a significant impact on the timing of product reviews, the number of inspections that are being conducted. And the government was quick to note that product review teams were not going to be impacted. Enforcement personnel were not going to be impacted. But nonetheless, trade press was talking about it. There was a lot of discussion among the industry about what's this going to do to our submissions? Are the review times going to be blown out? Longer times? Is this going to impact Q subs or pre-subs? I will say from my personal experience in dealing with submissions and enforcement responses is that I've seen a little bit of it, but not to the extent that was initially projected. We've had a couple meetings that have been canceled or were postponed. We're closer to when the RIF started. I've also had a couple enforcement actions where instead of having a meeting, the agency came back and said, well, we'd rather just go back and forth via email and have that sort of correspondence. But I don't know, Jody, what's been your experience in terms of the RIF and the impacts?
Yeah, I think one of the kind of bigger concerns, we haven't seen a lot of delays with respect to review timelines. I think the agency is still pretty committed to trying to hit those MDUFMA goals and get those submissions reviewed within the statutory timelines. I think probably where we may see the biggest impact is around pre-submissions, where there is not a statutory deadline. And as you suggested, the agency, that may be where the agency flexes a little bit. And I hope not. I hope that they continue to have those meetings and provide that invaluable feedback to industry around what the agency is going to need in those submissions, the incredible input on clinical trial designs, data burdens. And so those meetings are incredibly valuable. But if the agency has to look at places where their workforce, the reductions in workforce, needs to get a little bit of relief, that may be where the natural opportunity is. I think there is, one of the things that I am concerned about is the loss of institutional knowledge with both senior personnel deciding to leave the agency. A lot of that is going to go with them. And then also just the idea of just numbers. If you have fewer reviewers, the workload is probably still going to stay the same. And that's going to somehow have to be redistributed across fewer folks. And so it will be interesting as the agency adapts and tries to figure out how it's going to manage its existing workload with fewer individuals. I also worry about, the rifts and the changes in personnel. Hopefully we've hit a point where it starts to settle, but it would be hard to expect that not to have some sort of impact on morale. And then also just the ability to keep the folks who are still around in the agency, to keep them in the agency, and also bring in new reviewers and personnel, particularly in those technical spaces where it's really important to have people with deep technical expertise. And then, there's probably just some longer term impacts that we'll see in the coming days around shifts in policy, what's prioritized. It may be that just with fewer resources, that we may see FDA become a little bit more conservative in the way that they review submissions. But I think for the most part, there's a lot of areas where we need to just, as industry, wait and see how it sort of settles. Of course, recognizing that, overall, this administration is looking to do things differently. And so, as much as I want to say that everything is going to settle and then we're going to carry forward, it may well be kind of a different way of operating with the agency
A
going
new,
forward.
so to speak. Yeah.
Yep. So should we shift a little bit and talk about inspections and enforcement? Because, typically with the Republican administration, we see less enforcement.
Right. And I'll say so far, have not really seen a decrease or an increase in the number of inspections. Of course, those data are presented on FDA's website and you can track them. It's important to note, though, just the overall trend of inspections. Since 2016, so toward the end of the Obama administration and moving into Trump 1.0, the number of inspections globally was decreasing significantly. We hit high watermarks in the 2015, 2016 time period, and it had been going down consistently each year. Of course, in 2020, during COVID, there really weren't any on-site inspections that were occurring. I will say that the last couple of years, it's rebounded back up and it's been, around the pre-COVID numbers. But just looking at the overall trend, many companies have shifted and are now members of the Medical Device Single Audit Program, or MDSAP. And Canada made it a requirement to market medical devices in that country. So because of that, many companies, medical device manufacturers, joined the MDSAP, which allows them to be audited now by a qualified third party instead of the FDA. Of course, FDA still has authority to go in and conduct inspections for cause or for high priority devices, and also for pre-approval inspections. But I think a big part of the drop in inspections has been because of MDSAP. But I think with this administration, the trend will probably hold or maybe fracture, so to speak. I think that there's going to be a focus of shifting to non-US inspections or inspections of establishments that are outside the US. We're seeing movement right now, particularly on the pharma side, through executive orders, for example, based on statements that the president's made that foreign manufacturers have an unfair advantage over domestic manufacturers, and that a foreign manufacturer gets notice before FDA shows up and conducts the inspection, which is something that US manufacturers really do not have. So there is an executive order, which if you read it, read between the lines, is going to lead to more inspections overseas, and in particular, unannounced inspections overseas. Again, it's pharma related, but with a lot of things, pharma takes the lead and devices tend to follow after that. So I think that we will see an increase in foreign inspections, maybe not a bump of inspections, overall, but I think that where there will be a bump will be the percentage of non-US inspections to US inspections.
What about the reshoring efforts, right? Because, for medical device companies, it's not as easy as simply moving your manufacturing facility. And there's a cost and a timeline associated with that. But I think this administration very much is in favor of companies returning to the US for their manufacturing.
Right. Or moving or using domestic suppliers. It's an interesting point because if you're a class 3 manufacturer and making, PMA approved devices, to move the manufacturing, that requires a PMA supplement with the agency to get approval, and it also would require an inspection to it. So there are so many different factors associated with moving facilities to the United States. Even if it's a class 2 device, you still need to follow GMP. You still need to have validations of all of the processes. It isn't just flipping a switch. There's a lot more there. And that's just on the FDA side, not to mention state licenses, state permits, EPA requirements as well. So if any company that's looking at reshoring in the US, there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because we all learned during the pandemic how difficult it was to get product from manufactured in other countries, particularly China, into the US. And so we'll see what happens there.
Yes.
So can we talk a little bit about executive orders? There have been a number of key executive orders that came out that will impact the device industry. I think the big one is kind of the broad EO about deregulation. So, 10 regulations need to go away for everyone that gets proposed or promulgated. And, certainly FDA is an agency with a lot of regulations.
Right. So there were a number, you probably saw on Inauguration Day, all of the executive orders that were being signed. The key ones that I would say are one, that it immediately withdraws any rule that has not been sent for publication in the Federal Register. So any rule that was pending or that was to be published would be withdrawn or would need to be reviewed prior to publication in the Federal Register. Another executive order just freezes proposing or issuing any new rule until a department or agency head appointed by the president or designated by the president reviews and approves the rule. Another one that also postpones for 60 days the effective date of any rules that have already been published or promulgated that have not yet come into effect. So what does that impact? That would be the LDT, barring, that doesn't get thrown out by court order, that's not challenged, but also QMSR, the Quality Management System Regulation. Probably won't see that one come off the books, but certainly could see that one be delayed by a little bit just because of all of the progeny that goes with it. It would be QSIT, the Quality System Inspection Technique guidance would need to be revised. FDA's guidance on quality system requirements for PMA manufacturing sections. So there are a lot of things which cascade just from changing the QSR to the QMSR. And then, of course, you mentioned the 10 regs coming off for every one that gets proposed. I mean, that's significant. In Trump 1.0, it was a 4-to-1 ratio, and now it's extended to 10. What's interesting about it is not just its regulations, but it's a much broader scope. And so this would include guidances and policies. What's interesting as well is that FDA, even not FDA, but the government even has a website for which seeks recommendations for regulations to come off the books. So people can actually propose or recommend rules and regulations or guidances to come off of the regulatory docket. So I find that that's interesting. The other thing, too, is it needs to be a net zero. So meaning a net zero impact financially on the government. And we're still trying to figure out really what that means as far as the impact and financial impacts of what a net zero would be. If you're trying to, do two need to come off or a more expensive rulemaking? Who knows how that's going to work. Just the final thing that I'll say on this is, on the regulatory side, it's not necessarily, it's not an executive order at all, but it's the Supreme Court rulings from last year with Loper Bright and Corner Post. With Loper Bright basically eliminated the Chevron standard for challenging regulations. So it basically took away agency deference to ambiguous regulations and is now replacing it with judicial review, so to speak. Corner Post, which was decided the very next day, basically extended the statute of limitations from the day of implementation of the rule until when an actual injury occurs from the rule. So it's very significant, meaning that if you have a statute of limitations that was 10 years, if something happens 12 years after, it's still a valid challenge that can be made now because that statute of limitations has now changed. So I think that, particularly with Loper Bright, we'll see a host of regulations that are, I guess, questionable in taking liberties and reflecting prior administration's policies to close a gap in ambiguity of the statute. I think that those could very well be challenged.
And I guess, I think one of the things I think is unfortunate is if FDA decides to stop issuing guidance documents, because those have always been an articulation of the agency's thinking about a particular topic. And from, where I sit on the industry side, being able to have some insight into where the agency's head is has always been an advantage and incredibly helpful. And so, that doesn't mean I always agree with where the guidance comes out, but to at least have an idea of how they're thinking at least allows us the ability to sort of figure out how we're going to address those issues. So, and then, the agency comes out every year at the beginning of the year with a list of guidance documents it intends to issue. So we have some idea of what's coming. So, I am hopeful that they continue to issue those guidance documents. I will even say the ones I don't totally agree with, I would still like to see them.
Right. And I think what's really an enhancement to what we had, I guess, 10 years or so ago was the number of draft guidances, which were just remained on the books. And so we did see under prior administrations an initiative to get rid of those, either finalize them or get rid of them. So they were helpful in some respects, but as with any guidance, nothing's really enforceable. So, but I agree, it kind of shapes how you comply with the regulation because it shows the agency's current thinking on a particular topic. So it's informative. But let's turn back to the impacts on submissions and reviews. And we talked a little bit about how there's a potential for reviews to be a little bit delayed because of smaller crews working at the agency, smaller workforce. But we did recently hear FDA announce that it's running a pilot program to use AI to assist with product reviews. Like, what is this all about? And Jody, what do you think the impact's going to be on product reviews? Is it going to fill a void that people used to fill?
I think so. I mean, I think it's great that the agency is looking at ways to use technology to sort of do the work that they do. But I do think that there's some risks around using AI. And frankly, FDA using it in doing their work, they have the same challenges that industry has when we use it to do our work, right? So, for example, the way that you develop the algorithm that does the work, they've got the same black box problem that we have, which is transparency. If they're using it to assist in the review, depending on how the model is developed and how complex the algorithms are, it may be that the AI asks questions or raises issues that when it shows up in a request for additional information or the questions from the agency, as industry, it may be really hard to understand what they're looking for or how the risk assessment was made. And then, from there, if you can't understand the question, it gets really, really hard to figure out how to respond to it. And if it's the AI doing it, you're not really going to have a conversation with the algorithm where, we talk to humans, which means that the FDA reviewers are going to have to really understand, what the algorithm is looking for and where does the question come from. I think they also are going to have the same problems of bias and error. How you train the tool is going to be, garbage in, garbage out. So if there are existing biases, it may be only amplified in the way that FDA performs its review with the AI. So for example, I think it will be easier where there's a lot of data. So if you're talking about things in the 510K space, where there's lots of examples of prior reviews or lots of devices within the class, maybe you won't have as much of that. But if you're talking about PMAs and de novos, where the technology is very new and novel, and there's not a lot of prior experience, perhaps there may be some amplification of bias and error for those types of products. I also think, it may mean that we have less interaction with the human reviewers at FDA. And that has been an area where I think it has been a real advantage for industry to be able to talk to the reviewers, try to clarify things, get input, ask informal questions that may seem relatively small from an agency standpoint, but are huge on the industry side because it may tell you, do we go left or right? And so I do worry about if the AI serves too much of a role and becomes core as opposed to assistive, that the reviewers, we may not get the benefit of that sort of input. So, and then, there's just always, as you said, with the corner posts and Loper Bright and Chevron, it may be that using AI opens up potential for more challenges, which are always interesting to me as a lawyer. And it might be that it also opens up some of the information to become more publicly available. So, I think there's a lot of challenges to it, but I think there's a lot of upside to the agency using technology to do its work more efficiently.
Fascinating. So in light of these changes, and what are some things that you would recommend? Like, what are you advising your clients to do from a pre-market standpoint with personnel reductions and the use of AI? Like, what are things that companies can do?
I think when you're talking about submissions, they've got to be really clear. Think very carefully about how do you map to the tools that they're using so that your submissions can be actually reviewed much easier under whatever format they're using. Use the tags and headers and use AI tools to help you sort of format these things in the same way because that's what's used doing the reviews. Think about accessibility. Things may become more available publicly. Think about the precedent because that's the data that is going to feed those algorithms. And so you should be looking at what the precedents look like before you submit to make sure that you're trying to answer those questions. I do think pre-submissions are still going to be a thing. I hope they're still going to be a thing. And so we may start including in our pre-submission request questions around, do you intend to use AI to review these submissions? Is this a product category where AI is going to play a role in assisting in the reviews? And, I would want to know that because that may mean I construct my submission a little bit differently. Ask for opportunities to participate in pilots if it makes sense. FDA does have a number of pilot programs where maybe it would be beneficial to be a part of those. Keep on top of policy shifts, see where the agency is as best you can. I do think industry groups are being very on top of where the agency is moving. Think about the outcomes out of these pilot programs. I think, FDA has always done a great job of developing pilot programs to kind of see how does it work? And many of them have become actual programs. So a good example of that is the predetermined change control plan that started as a pilot program and now it's a real thing. But I think, participating in it and partnering with the agency is, if you're ready, might be a really beneficial thing.
Mm-hmm. I'll put you on the spot with the AI, which is only going through a pilot right now. But do you think that FDA is going to change the format by which submissions are submitted to the agency? I know we just shifted to eStar. Do you think that there are going to be additional changes to accommodate data so that AI can be used to review it?
I think so. And I think that so eStar, rolled out a couple of years ago. They've already kind of made tweaks and adjustments to the way that eStar works. I think they will need to if they want the AI to be able to kind of review in some sort of standardized way the data that's submitted in applications. I think they're going to need to. But right now, the way that those submissions are constructed, they are kind of categories of information. And so I think maybe they won't have to. But it really depends, as I said, garbage in, garbage out. How good is your data? How good is your submission to facilitate, hopefully, an easy review?
Yeah, time will tell.
Mm-hmm. So what do we think on post-market, right? So lots of post-market implications, lots of pre-market implications. But what do you think companies should be doing to get themselves ready for post-market changes?
Right. I think it's just important to be prepared. As you said before, things are changing quite quickly. So it's very important to stay on top of new initiatives and policies and statements coming from the administration at the highest of levels. So pay attention to things like tariffs and trade negotiations and think of what those impacts are going to be on supply chains. As we've talked about, there will be efforts for reshoring, for nearshoring, and now friendshoring. So important to keep tabs on, is there a country that's on the naughty list that the tariffs are going to be higher? Would it be important to maybe get components or parts or raw materials from another country where perhaps the tariffs aren't going to be as high or not as high? Unfortunately, those things kind of ebb and flow. Recent history is they're changing by the day. So it's important to keep track of that. And as we mentioned before, just inspection readiness, particularly for non-U.S. establishments. Be prepared for FDA to come in and conduct an inspection. And whether it's in 2025, which is still QSR, or moving into 2026, where it's going to be the QMSR, which is more of a ISO 1345 oriented quality management system, just be prepared and just know that things like internal audit reports, management reviews, supplier audits, those are no longer going to be protected from review by an FDA investigator. Those are going to be fair game for review. So I think it will be important to know how those documents should be drafted, to know that things in those documents could lead to inspectional observations. So leading into training, I think training is critically important for your personnel to be prepared for that, for the inspection and the shift from the QSR to the QMSR. I think for overseas companies in particular, we're going to continue to see border enforcement, import detentions, and the use of import alerts. I do think that even though it's a Republican administration, I do think that enforcement is not necessarily going to go down. It may shift in format, as we saw the recent overcriminalization executive order which just came out, which basically is de-emphasizing or recommending the use of enforcement discretion to not escalate to DOJ for criminal, even for the strict liability aspects of the statute. So it's not to say that nothing's going to be criminally enforced. I think it'll be reserved for the more egregious cases, but just not forget that, FDA is a law enforcement agency and they have an abundance of arrows in that quiver, so to speak. There are a lot of other enforcement mechanisms that can be used, warning letters under the administrative or civil penalties, and a number of other actions that can be taken, as I mentioned before, import alerts and import detentions for foreign made products. So I think, we're going to definitely see some enforcement actions. We know that FDA is out inspecting right now. We're still seeing 43s being issued. So it'll be interesting to see if this trend continues or if there's a new trend that's going to evolve.
Yeah. And I will also say, we've actually also seen a number of warning letters issued, which, although I haven't run the numbers, feels like there are more than there have been historically over the past, 18, 24 months.
Yeah.
So the agency is out there doing what it does, which is protect the public health. So, but we'll see where it goes forward. I think for both of us, I'll speak for myself. In the past almost 30 years that I've been doing this work, I feel like it's a new day and everything is different. Things are changing fast, really fast. It's by the day, by the hour, and in some cases by the minute. And so now more than ever, I think companies and industries and people who play in this space really need to be paying attention as things develop. And I think the word of the day is probably disruption, and be prepared to adapt, which, is not the best for long-term planning, but I do think it makes it really interesting to be in this industry and trying to figure out how do we do what it is we all want to do, which is help patients.
Right. I feel like we've only hit the tip of the iceberg in all the topics. Like we could just go on and on and on. So many things that have been happening, and it really has been quite an interesting and eventful several months. But as this series continues, we're going to continue to weave in just the latest on regulations and policies and their potential impacts on medical device manufacturers as we move along. So thanks again for joining us for this inaugural edition, and the conversation is only beginning.